Welcome to our webinar and panel discussion on the state of supply chain. In this webinar, we're going to explore some of the top pain points and challenges for manufacturers in the new shortage economy. We'll talk about the people, process, and technology in supply chain, as well as overcoming the barriers to digitally transforming the factory. And for our panel today, we have a number of seasoned industry veterans, including people from LeanDNA, AME, as well as Deloitte. And my name is Kamalina, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel discussion today. I think it's going to be a really exciting one. My experience spans product management and marketing for B2B vendors. And throughout my career, I've actually spent a lot of time working with global manufacturers around the world and visiting factories as well. So this topic is really interesting to me. And it's also a really hot topic right now. So I hope that you'll really enjoy the discussion that we're having today. So with that, we'll get into meeting all of our panelists here today, and we'll go ahead and get started with Robert. So Robert is a business leader, author, speaker, educator, and strategic advisor, and he serves as a director at large on the AME board of directors. And he's also a business leader with an entrepreneurial focus. So Robert has spent over 15 years as the founder and CEO of the LeanCore Supply Chain Group, which was acquired by Uber Freight in 2020. And Robert also created Trail Paths to focus on research and education of the human side of lean thinking, leadership, and workforce development. So with that, thank you, Robert, for joining us today. If you want to say hello to the audience.
Hello, audience. And Kamalina, thank you so much for all your hard work. And it's my pleasure to be representing AME and participating with Lou and Richard today. I've really been looking forward to this. It's going to be a lot of fun.
We're really happy to have you. So next up is Lou Lebrandi. He's a principal of Deloitte Consulting, and he's focused on the manufacturing sector, and he's a leader in the firm's supply chain and network operations practice. So with more than 25 years of experience in the field, Lou has spent most of his career focused on automotive, aerospace, and industrial product sectors. And he also leads the smart factory efforts at some of the OEMs out there to improve near-term performance and essentially step change transformation across the entire value chain. Thank you so much, Lou, for joining us.
Thanks, Kamalina. It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks for the nice intro.
Me too. And last but not least, we have Richard from my company, LeanDNA. So Richard Lebovitz is the founder and CEO of LeanDNA, a cloud-based platform that helps to align materials procurement to production plans. And prior to LeanDNA, Richard was actually the founder and CEO of another company named Factory Logic, which was acquired by SAP. And he's led lean conversion projects in over 15 countries. So that's quite a feat there. Richard's also a board member for AME and was awarded the Shingo Prize for Manufacturing Excellence in 2001 and was recently named last year the Supply and Demand Chain Executive's Supply Chain Pro to Know of the Year. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today as well.
Thank you, Kamalina. Excited to be here. And I've been involved with AME for the past 15 years, a great organization. Excited about the topic we're going to discuss today and look forward to some of the Q&A towards the end.
Same here. So with that, let's delve right in. I want to talk a little about the report first. So that's kind of serving as the inspiration for the panel discussion that we're having today. So the report is something that LeanDNA and the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, AME, it's based on some survey and market research that we conducted together to explore specific areas in which manufacturers are looking to do things like digitally invest, some of the top challenges inhibiting that transformation, and some of the biggest opportunities on the table for 2021, 2022, and beyond as well. So in the survey itself, the report includes a number of really interesting data points, and we'll go through several of these today as we delve into the discussion topics and into the questions that the panel is going to be discussing. And it can be downloaded from either the LeanDNA.com site or the AME.org website. So I do incite you to kind of go and take a look at the full report if you haven't already as well. And the report goes into a number of topics beyond what we mentioned earlier. So things like the people, process, and technology aspects of what we're talking about today, the tips for thriving in today's shortage economy, which we'll talk about in more detail as well. Some key careabouts and challenges of professionals in both manufacturing and supply chain, and the role of digital transformation in the space. So with that, let's get right into it. So let's start with this concept of the shortage economy. So there's really no denying that manufacturers have felt hardships over the last 2 years. And whether it's meeting shortage management goals, production output, or cash flow targets, manufacturers in all industries are really hit hard by shortages and the effects of the current economic climate. And a lot of these headlines that you see here, it's really been dominated by by these concepts, shortages and disruptions, due to the COVID pandemic and other things happening in the world today. So in the market research report, one of the interesting facts was that it was actually over 4 in 5 manufacturers, but a really large number. So over 4 in 5, more than 4 out of 5 manufacturers suffered major supply chain disruptions from the pandemic itself. And manufacturers have felt this in a lot of different ways, from supply chain disruptions to difficulty in accurately predicting demand to workforce issues. And manufacturers really have been responding to volatile and dynamic demand and forecast planning. And most have seen shortages or inventory excesses, and some have even seen both. So the idea that they're able to kind of efficiently bring all aspects of supply chain together to help manage everything from planning all the way to production is pretty key. This past year, especially the last 2 years since the pandemic begun, it's kind of proved to also be the perfect storm, if you will. So while there certainly were new challenges that arose, one theory is that it really was the ideal ingredients that happened over the last 2 years to cause what's going on today and for everything to really culminate to a tipping point. So with that, I want to pose kind of the first question to the panel. We can pretty much all agree that we're in a shortage economy right now. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what got us. So let's go ahead and start with Richard.
Thanks, Kamala. So I see 2 big trends happening over the last 10 to 15 years that have contributed to the problems we actually are seeing today. The first is the increasing levels of product customization from the products you buy at Home Depot, whether it's appliances, grills, different consumer goods, or it's the airplanes you fly in. There's an increasing number of options and configurations. Customers love it, marketing loves it, but it actually creates a lot of challenges for manufacturing that actually have to make those highly customized goods. So that's one trend. The second major trend is the globalization of the supplier base and the increasing levels of the tiers within those suppliers. As manufacturing has shifted to more assembly, there's a growing reliance on suppliers to deliver parts from all over the world. And this is creating a challenge in the supply chain. Part of this has been driven by outsourcing to achieve like the lowest cost price, but they failed to really consider the impact that this is having on delivery. So there's a question of what really is that total cost when you made those decisions. So there's some business decisions that drove some of it. So the combination of increasing product configuration in the factory with less control over your supply chain has been one of the key drivers of the shortages today. And the issue in production is that it can only take one missing part to sometimes potentially stop the line. It could be semiconductor chips that we're running into. I know here in Texas, there was the resin, but sometimes it can just take that one part that if we don't get it, it has a huge disruption on overall production. One of the interesting facts from the survey was that exception messages are up almost 300%, which I believe is reflective of the challenges with trying to manage supply chain complexity today. So even though investments are being made in supply chain technologies throughout the enterprise, the primary tools being used in the factory operations today are still spreadsheets. So in terms of the question commonly you posed, in terms of what got us here, I believe it's a combination of these trends I mentioned earlier, the growing disruptions we're living in the supply chain, but also the lack of tools that has led us to the situation we're in today.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I would love to kind of get Lou's perspective on this as well.
Thanks, Kamala. Yeah, Richard, just building on that, I mean, I think you really hit hard a lot of the key things driving material availability. And then you kind of layer onto that complexity and that landscape to some of the bigger macroeconomic policies, that businesses and governments have laid out there, the continually stimulus printing of money during this pandemic and disruption. Demand really didn't taper off, to the degree a lot of people thought it was going to. And then in the result of that, it really did lead to an overall talent shortage. So multiple tiers of the supply chain are, no one's exempt from that challenge of attracting talent. And it's leading, to, longer lead times, being able to go and attract people to be able to come to, smaller markets. You have some instances, it's actually having a pretty significant impact. Just to, you'll have cafeteria workers that, sometimes are getting paid more than frontline unionized mechanics. So it's creating this really interesting dynamic of how companies need to, address that challenge. So.
What about Robert?
Yeah, I know,
What is your take on
Camelina,
this?
your report's awesome, and I like the way it says 4 out of 5 manufacturers are saying disruption. I'd like to know who that 5th manufacturer is that says there's been no disruption. They must either be completely optimistic or they haven't been paying attention, because I've 100% of the people and executives I talk to have not exactly been having much fun in the supply chain in the last 2 years. But just building on everything that Lou and Richard have said, which really, took us into people, process, and technology, which is really the 3 cornerstones of manufacturing strategy. I think just to add to that list is that just the essence of supply chain risk, I think, was misunderstood. Like up until 2 years ago, supply chain risk meant what is the risk that we have of our supply being interrupted? And those are all the things that Richard and Lou just described. Between the people side that Lou described and the processes side, lead time, complexity. But what's interesting is that very, very few organizations ever define supply chain risk on the demand side. In other words, they never ask themselves, well, what would we do if demand went up by 10 times of what we've ever imagined, or if demand went to 0? So while we always understood supply chain risk as what is the risk of our supply being interrupted, where are our suppliers, who are they dependable, and so forth, I don't think anybody did any, game planning around what would happen if all of a sudden we needed to produce 10 times more than we need today, or the corollary of that, or the opposite of that, is what would happen if we actually didn't need to produce anything. And I think that created some surprises for us as well.
It sounds like it's not just supply chain issues as well, but it's really business issues around preparedness for a lot of these kinds of things. So thank you for those responses. What it makes me think of is the fact that, and something I've heard many people say in this recent times, is that if manufacturers can figure out how to deal and thrive with what's going on right now, that they'll be resilient in whatever is going to come up in the future, and that they'll be able to navigate anything that comes up in the future. So that's something that I'd love to kind of delve into further as well as we go through this. In preparation for our next question, I'll just share some more survey data here. So in the survey, we also asked manufacturers about their top factory management issues. And while the responses were quite diverse, there was a focus on lean and efficient approaches to process improvement, being able to throttle production capacity, workforce retention, and talent acquisition. But also risk reduction and cost savings measures showed up in some of the responses that we got from the survey participants. When we look at inventory management in particular, though, the main responses were really around reducing shortages. So quickly followed by things like improving inventory turnover and efficiency, but also improving on-time delivery, decision-making, cash flow, and supplier performance came up quite a lot as well. And the last piece of data that I want to show kind of before we go into the next question, we also asked about some of the permanent changes manufacturers are making to supply chain management strategy. And some of the responses we found interesting. So one was, they were saying that they want increased visibility into factory inventory levels and needs. They want to digitize supply chain data to make faster, more efficient decisions. They want to spend time consolidating, diversifying, and digitizing their supplier base and collaboration with suppliers. And then also optimize inventory levels and turns to save cash and improve working capital. So with that, I would love to ask the panel now, what are some of the biggest challenges faced today by these manufacturers, and how are they typically trying to solve them today? So, and for this one, I'll actually ask Lou first.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you called it out. I think obviously, as most people on the phone, they would say, material availability. How do I get the, balance that to make sure I have proper buffers in my inventory to offset the risk, whether it's lead time risk or talent risk or, capital equipment availability. Trying to get that equation right. I think, Robert, you mentioned, during the last Q&A portion of just, how do I, balance and have the right technology available to me to be able to forecast properly. So as demand spikes, what does that do to my traditional forecasting models? And how do I deploy my cash properly to be able to buffer against that risk as it's changing so dynamically? And again, that's that. I think companies are trying to find that right balance between like how much, from a cash flow impact versus how much do I want to store in raw material so that they can try to contract their own lead times. And then that just begs the question, as you are trying to cycle your overall, cycle times, do I have the right, technology infrastructure in place to be able to actually scale my business and be able to react to those types of disruptions? So as far as how, obviously companies are trying to solve it. I think a lot of people are looking at new, I'll say smart technologies to be able to get that visibility from their capital. They're looking at how their supply chains constructed. There's been this trend even prior to the pandemic of people trying to reshore their supply base, moving away from just pure low cost country. Even seeing trends of bigger OEMs going more vertical and rethinking their broader just manufacturing strategy. Again, all meant to try to help solve for this lead time problem, the overall logistics end-to-end span. People have been making big investments in those areas.
And what about Robert? What's your take on this?
Yeah, and building on everything that Lou just said, I think when we have the conversation about what are people challenged with today and how are they trying to solve them, I think we do need to contain the conversation, whether this is pandemic related or post-pandemic. So for sure, because of the pandemic, we've got the shortages and the weaknesses that Richard talked about earlier. But it begs the question, okay, well, but what are the challenges that manufacturers and how are we going to solve these things once we normalize for the disruptions that were created specifically because of the pandemic relative to workforce and interruptions and so forth? And in my mind, Camelina, you just mentioned it earlier that, what the world is now calling supply chain problems, there's quite a few of us that are saying, these aren't supply chain problems. These are business problems. They just happen to be manifested in the supply chain. And so we do know that manufacturers are now faced with extended lead times that we never really quite learned how to manage. We extended them without extending the knowledge base of our people and our processes and our technologies to manage these extended lead times. And I think that we've also realized now, and Lou just talked about this, I think it all summarized in one word is flexibility. So I think one of the biggest challenges manufacturers now realize is that they have to be more flexible. And flexibility is going to be improving our flexibility is going to be the solution set going forward. And that's going to have to run right into the world of lead time, because these extended lead times just make us so inflexible that we can't react, as Lou just talked about, which is what we're going to have to be able to do. So I think that the challenges that we're going to face as organizations are going to have to realize that they're a business. They have 4 core processes: strategy, product development, sales and marketing, and supply chain operations. And while we all think this new world has been a supply chain disruption, it's actually a business disruption, because all of the decisions made in product development and sales and marketing and supply chain are responsible for some of the challenges that we've been having.
I think both of you brought up really interesting points there. That, there's kind of that mix of containment strategies that companies can be taking to kind of deal with the issues at hand, but there's also kind of that flexibility and that longer term thinking that they need to do to be able to really solve this going forward. Richard, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, so just adding to what Robert and Lou mentioned, one interesting thing, especially with the group at AME, is there's like that visual that people look at, which is as you lower the water in a stream, sometimes the rocks are there, you just don't see it. But as you start to lower the water, these problems become apparent. So I think today we're kind of in a mix of certain things actually existed before, but with things going on right now it's becoming apparent and people are starting to work on it. And one of the things that I've felt is that when you look at supply chain, it's really taken years for manufacturers to establish this kind of well-coordinated, balanced, synchronized supply chain. And then we pretty much shut it down almost overnight due to COVID. And now we're trying to quickly ramp up the people, the suppliers in a balanced way. And it's just a real challenge. And one of the issues worrying manufacturers today is that we're seeing increasing in shortages, and everybody's hearing about that. But we're also seeing excess inventory growing at the same time. And some of the managers that we talk to and leaders, they don't understand why, and we hear that a lot. So part of the problem is that there's a lot of noise in the system, and people don't have enough supply chain visibility to prioritize what actions need to be taken. So while shortages are a big problem today, there's a growing concern right now over the excess inventory that we're going to start to see maybe 6 to 9 months from now. And when you combine that with inflation, it could be a real problem. So what teams are often missing is that if you don't manage the excess even today, it can create more shortages because you have suppliers that are using what limited capacity they have, which is already stretched, to make parts that are not needed, while the parts that are short, that are critical, those are not taking top of mind in terms of the production and getting scheduled ahead of other things that are maybe excess. So it's not always clear what they need to focus on. So in terms of how are the manufacturing companies, to your question, Kamalina, how are they solving it today? Unfortunately, there's a lot of firefighting and overtime, and people aren't always working on the right priorities. So getting alignment is very, very important. We want everybody fighting the same procurement issues in a very coordinated way. So making the actions more visible is key. And then we need to be able to hold the right group accountable to making sure we're getting those actions resolved. I would say that companies that are breaking down these silos of communications, they're aligning everyone on the right priorities to meet customer delivery and enabling better collaboration through technology, are seeing dramatic improvements versus those that aren't applying some of these methodologies.
That's very interesting. I think there's definitely a lot of people and process things that you've all brought up, but a few of you also mentioned technology very specifically. So let's kind of shift in that direction and move towards the next question as well. So when we talk about technology for a second, one of the things that our survey results said is that 75% of the respondents really felt pressured to digitally transform due to what was going on in the economic climate today. And even 95% were investing in things like factory operations and factory automation, but most hadn't automated critical data yet for supply chain operations. So when we look at some of that data in more detail, for a large majority, digital transformation actually means things like very advanced analytics, predictive intelligence, and includes things like machine learning and AI. So more modern technologies that are not necessarily widespread yet in the space. And with that, I'd kind of like to ask the question to the group about technology and the role of technology in the supply chain and in some of these business issues that we're talking about today. So let's dig into that deeper and tell me how technology can better help address manufacturers' biggest challenges and what role technology plays in kind of the next generation of digital transformation that's occurring in manufacturing. So with that, Robert, I'll let you take this one first.
Yeah, thank you, Kamalina. So when I think of technology, I think of kind of a framework of three core processes: visibility, capability, and then resilience. So invisibility is just what is our ability to see what's happening and where it's happening. Capability is what is our ability to react to after we see what's happening and where it's happening, what's our ability to react to it. And then resilience is what's our ability to sustain that reaction. So, and I think technologies are helping us in all three of these areas. And from a visibility point of view, we clearly, like, the first thing that organizations learned 2 years ago was that they really a lot of people didn't even know where their suppliers were, how many part numbers they had. So technologies like for plan for every part and just basic visibility tools are clearly on the forefront now. And you can see that in the organizations and the technology companies that are now household names in industry that we didn't even know that they existed 2 years ago. On the capability side, I think the tools that you mentioned in the slide from the report, a lot of those have to do with being able to make better business decisions. And there's clearly we have to be able to make better decisions faster than we once did. And that means we're going to have tools, because your ability to scale effective decision making has a technology element to it, because you can't scale people's hours. We've learned that all too well. And then on the resilience part, which is our ability to sustain our reaction, that's going to be around teaching the lean discipline of plan, do, check, act. So we created it, we had visibility, we created a new plan, and now we're going to have to execute and then revise it to see what worked and what didn't. And clearly our technology tools providing the visibility and data and knowledge from the data are going to help us with those things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And of course, to make people more efficient, that's kind of the purpose of technology. And we want it to help us, be more efficient, make things better. With that, I'd love to hear Deloitte's perspective on this, because technology is your game.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think Robert hit on it. I think most people realize that their current technology platforms were not well suited or mature enough, or provided them the capability that they needed to be able to scale their business and give them the flexibility to allow their limited workforce to be able to quickly respond and adapt to a changing demand. But that being said, look, I mean, it's never just about technology, right? Your technology, no matter what platform that you put in, is not going to solve all of your problems. If you have bad processes and you have inadequate training and skill sets, regardless of how much you invest and dump into a new technology platform, you're not going to get the results that you were planning for and capture the value of these big capital investments. But that being said, it's a transformation approach that has to take place, and really focus on just not, is this the right package and technology that's going to provide me the capabilities and platform that I need to run my business, but do I need new skill sets? Do I need, different type of, people and skills to be able to run those processes? This really gets into a very interesting change management. Just like anything or any big transformation, it does come down to companies' ability to accept that change and make sure that it's being clearly communicated about what they're doing and why they're putting the platform in, and use the technology transformation to address those big process gaps. And a lot of times, companies, because they're in firefighting mode, they underinvest in the change management piece. And that is a critical piece that truly to capture, people need to focus on, and our clients need to focus on, regardless of what. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I know, I wasn't sure if you were gonna add more to that.
Yeah, I could go on this topic for quite some time, but I know high level, I think, as some of the big points, I wanted to make sure that we got out there to this group, and Richard, I'm sure you and want to weigh into.
Well, yeah, just Lou, adding to something you said, having spent like really the last 30 years of having one foot in the supply chain, lean manufacturing space, the other in the technology, I agree with what Lou said, that you really need to understand like what technology is working, what's needed, what's a people process related issue versus how to deploy technology. So it's really leveraging what you have. I remember cases where people would talk about, we're implementing Kanban and pull, so we don't need an MRP system. Well, it's just not true. It's just understanding what are those tools really needed for, and how do they work, and what are the gaps, and how do we leverage technology to bridge that gap. And I would say that things like technology ERP systems are very good at like aggregating data, planning, and storing master data, but daily supply chain decision making is still very siloed. So like the role of a production planner or a line planner with the buyer and a supplier are often, those roles are often working on different priorities and have non-standard workflows. Even though it's a common set of data, the way in which they use that data tends to be a lot of local decision making and based on different workflows, and also some very manual processes. So this local decision making and disconnected prioritization at each of these stages is one of the drivers of the bullwhip effect that many of you hear about today. I was always surprised driving into work and I'm hearing about the bullwhip effect in the beer game. And it's just amazing how these issues we're teaching people about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, now they're talking about on the news. So the key is to leverage technology to establish visibility into these priorities that matter for execution, and also leveraging technology to enable collaboration throughout the supply chain. Production is working hard day to day to try to meet customer delivery needs, and we need to get the planners, buyers, and suppliers to be aligned on the right supply chain priorities. The good thing is that, and Lou, you kind of hit on the good thing about digital transformation, it doesn't mean necessarily like rebuilding the entire technology stack from scratch. Rather, it can mean, how do we leverage data, harness better insights from these existing systems to drive better results and ultimately make work easier for people. Whenever I walk around a factory, I remember my Japanese partners would teach me that, at the end of the day, all these buzzwords, at the end of the day, you're trying to make the work easy for people. And if they do that, they work better, more efficient, more productive, higher quality. So the best way to make people adopt change and successfully drive digital transformation is by providing them the tools that make their work easier. And if we do that, they see more success, we get better stickiness, we see better results.
I think one of the common themes that you all talked about is really that if the processes are immature, then they're not going to get the most out of the technology. And another part of it is that that I'm gathering from what all of you are saying is that it's no single part of the process that really needs to be fixed. No single technology alone, either tied to a single part of the process. It's really everything in the interaction between many of these different areas that tend to be siloed today. So things from demand forecasting all the way to procurement, to production planning, to supplier collaboration. So I think that's really interesting to note as part of this. And as we kind of move on to the next part of this, I want to stick on the technology point for a second, because the interesting thing is that despite so many people who responded to the survey saying that they really wanted to implement things like predictive intelligence and advanced analytics, things like machine learning or AI as part of their digital transformation strategies, a lot of basic issues are holding them back. So we're talking about things like the fact that they're relying heavily on manual processes, on static spreadsheets, on point-in-time data that's not giving them a real-time view. Many enterprise systems that are kind of disparate and disconnected as well, and they're not really giving them, the data and the information and the visibility they need to make decisions and to really implement any of these processes or technology fully and get the most out of those. And with that, it's about an overwhelming 9 out of 10 manufacturers who said that they lack visibility to prioritize and forecast due to their reliance on spreadsheets, these disjointed systems, and these manual processes as well. But hurdles that are coming up when we asked in the survey itself, hurdles to factory transformation really fall outside of the technology itself and touch on many of the things that each of you talked about a little bit. So most companies and most respondents who took part of the market research in the survey talked about limited expertise, limited resources, limited budget, and even ineffective change management, which was something that you all talked about a lot. So with that, let's dig into that a little bit more and talk about what are some of the shortcomings that are really preventing progress and the adoption of these new technologies and new ways of working and new solutions and approaches. And with that, I'll hand it off to Robert to answer this one first.
Well, thanks, Camelina. And, this is goes to kind of the essence of, I think, the work we've been doing for a long time in lean and operational excellence. And, certainly is what AME has been promoting, in their Learn, Share, Grow framework of what they're trying to accomplish as well. And we are trying to teach organizations to be end-to-end thinkers. There's no question about that. And clearly, to be end-to-end, in particular in complex global supply chains, there has to be technologies that are going to support that. But we're just not, the big shortcoming is we're just not there yet. We don't have executives all really understanding that they're managing a system. They're not managing their function, they're managing a system, and the system goes outside of their four walls. It goes to their suppliers, up to their customers. And for us to truly see that as an ecosystem where a decision made in one part of the system will absolutely have an impact somewhere else in the system, we still need to continue to educate leaders and managers on systems thinking relative to end-to-end thinking inside our businesses. And our technologies are going to have to take us there. And I think there's going to be the first thing that's going to happen is trust. I know Lou and Richard and I have talked about this. Until we actually truly trust partners and departments and so forth, we're not going to, the technology is not going to be effective. And then the other part is the evildoers in the world, and it's very unfortunate, but it's the world we live in. And just on Sunday, one of the biggest global freight forwarders in the world had a cyber attack. And so today, this week has been just bad and very, very painful for a lot of manufacturers who work with that particular supplier. And so these are real, and these are not things that we can just put under the carpet. And so I think trust and understanding how, even if the technology can do it, how will we make sure that we aren't putting our businesses at risk? These are going to be some of the things that are front and center.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of things that are still happening in today's world that are affecting this as well, like you mentioned. Richard, what's your take on this one?
So kind of feeding into what Robert mentioned, there was a book that came out many, many years ago called Learning to See. And it, to some degree, some of the methodology behind it wasn't that new, but it really highlighted the idea that if you're really going to make improvements, the first step is really, learn to see, understand what the problems are. And if you spend a lot more time understanding the problems and what's causing it, then sometimes the solution can become much quicker. So when I look at the challenges that we're talking about now with shortages and inventory optimization, the good thing now is that they're becoming much clearer. People are starting to understand it. And I would argue that to some degree, a lot of this existed in the past, as I mentioned earlier, but now everybody's starting to see it, right? They understand the impact. Definitely world situation has caused some of that, but now we can see. So we hear about these issues every day, but the challenge right now is that the solution and what is the optimal strategy, that they should take for most companies is not clear. So the problem is becoming clearer, but the solution is not. And the reliance on the spreadsheets is coming. You highlighted some of the survey results that came out, is really, in my opinion, one thing that's preventing progress. So when you talk about the question of preventing progress, these reliance on spreadsheets is preventing progress and making it difficult to establish these standardized processes that are more real time and people can drive the people to work in the way that they need to. The teams and the leadership, I believe, want to improve, but the technology is encouraging people to work in silos and then pushing them back to not being standardized, when they make that reversion. The other thing that the survey showed is that there's this linkage, as Robert mentioned as well, about the mix of people, technology, and process, right? That today, it's often hard for people to identify the right action to take, and it's a mix of all three of those that's driving it. So there's this growing gap, in my opinion, as well, between the people that are living the problem day to day and the technology providers. So like, are we giving the right solution? Are we making their jobs earlier? And I think that's something that's preventing progress. And that's also causing a lot of these starts and stops when it comes to these failed solution implementation. And then again, that's those start and stops when things don't work, when there's a lot of hype around it, then that can also be responsible for the people that are tasked with the execution day to day to revert back again to spreadsheets. So that's one big issue I think that's creating challenges with progress. I'd say the other thing is just the challenge with getting accurate information and making it visible. So going back to learning to see, it's not just, regarding the factory, it's how do we learn to see these issues through data? And that's a big challenge. So creating good data needs to be part of the process. And that process also doesn't or shouldn't be a one-time event. Creating good quality information is not just let's do it and we're done, but it's how do we create a whole systematic way of thinking around supply chain data and visibility to make our ability to react better. And some of that has to do with creating shared and synchronized views around information. And ultimately the goal is to leverage technology to complement these existing solutions, not replace it, and then help people use these newer solutions to shift from kind of a reactive firefighting mode to one now they can be more proactive in the way that they work based on better prioritized actions and better and more accurate information.
That makes sense. And I think that the fact that manufacturers, to deal with a lot of things that are happening today, are kind of falling into the trap of being reactive. We're hearing a lot of stories, even from our own customers, of manufacturers, spending exorbitant amounts of money, for example, just to expedite parts, only to find out that they don't have other parts that they need to actually allow production to continue. So I think there's some really good examples there of how fixing and addressing some of these shortcomings can also help manufacturers to get out of this reactive firefighting kind of state of being. So Lou, what's your take on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, Richard, you touched on some multiple interesting topics that we see people struggling with, and one of them at its core is just around the data. And you go through these big implementations, and I think if most people, when they look back, they struggle adopting it is because they have underlying data issues. And so how do we go through, clean the data so they can actually trust it? And then as you're adopting the technology, then you get a whole nother overwhelming level of insight, and you have this big digital data exhaust. So then how do you sift through that so that you can get that down to critical data sets that you can make decisions on? More importantly, then that leads back to the overall change management process. So then how do you structure your organization? How do you break out of this firefighting mode? How do you be more predictive and leveraging the technology and leveraging those investments? There's no, unfortunately, easy button. When you're going down this path, it is a hard effort, and you can use these types of projects and implementations to just address some of those fundamental issues that, again, prior to the pandemic, I think it's no surprise, right? That a lot of times people's data is not clean. And what then that happens, right? It's a self-perpetuating cycle. People then stop using the system because they don't trust what was coming out of the system. So then they revert back to these manual spreadsheets. So now you have a bunch of activity that's kind of off the reservation happening, and no one has visibility into it because no one's really trusting what the system is providing them. And then that gets permeated throughout the multiple tiers of the supply chain. So think through how you're communicating demand to your suppliers. People are investing a lot of time trying to say, well, look, I need better visibility into how my sub-tier suppliers are performing. Yet they leverage a lot of tools that, unfortunately, and bad habits they don't really treat suppliers like true partners. It's a very tactical relationship. Like, I'm sending you demand. I need you to lower your price. I need you to meet my lead time. And that behavior, again, it results in a lot of mistrust. So now all of a sudden I'm like, hey, I want to put in like a control tower, and I want to be able to have visibility into you're one of my partners. I want to be able to see where you are in your manufacturing process, and I also want to see your sub tiers as well. And I think the supply base is pushing back a little bit on that. And so there's a different level of complexity, I think, as things are going to have to mature and get over, and that kind of starts with the OEMs and developing that trust, figuring out these are key suppliers that you need to grow your business, and they're an integral part. So
yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it, and especially with fewer resources, there does need to be kind of that two-way communication, and for that communication to be a lot more efficient than just kind of that one-way data transfer like you're referring to. So with that, we have one more question left. So I might pose this to a few people on here and then ask for closing remarks. I do want to leave time for Q&A as well. So I'm going to actually ask this to Robert first, but what does and doesn't come as a surprise from the survey results that you took a look at?
Yeah, well, Camelina, I think we kind of touched upon it a little bit, but what doesn't come as a surprise is the interruptions and the supply chain disruptions and material availability and shortcomings and all those things, because that's just simply what we're feeling. So I think that it's no surprise at all that everybody is saying, yeah, I'm feeling all of these things, because there's no question we are in this together. What came as a surprise to me is when in the results of your study, where we're asking, well, what are people going to be focused on? It didn't surprise me that we're going to focus on workforce development. This is absolutely critical, but it did surprise me that there wasn't more attention to lead time reduction. Mentioned a little bit, but I would have thought that questioning our extended lead times and questioning the horizons that we've created because of these extended lead times I would think that would be a big thing that we would be looking at in the future. And that wasn't really the star of this is what we're going to do going forward. And that surprised me a little bit.
Yeah. And Richard, any surprises on your end from the survey data?
Yeah, I'll just say maybe quickly, I know we're running out of time, but it was interesting to see that the top management priorities were on reducing shortages and improving inventory turns, but then it also flagged that the supply chain teams don't feel that they have the necessary information. So to me, it was really highlighting the fact that we just can't provide data and visibility as the solution, but we need to think about each role in the supply chain, how they work and how we enable better prioritization and collaboration, starting to, breaking down the barriers, prioritizing what has to be done across these barriers, removing the silos, and then supporting the workflow to help everyone execute better, I think is key. And the last thing I would just say is that, to me, what kind of jumped out was just the need for collaboration and real-time information, prioritizing this information, and then, creating these kind of shared views or shared information that's critical to get in front of this reactive firefighting that's commonplace today.
Yeah, thanks for that input. I think that's really interesting as well, and something that definitely makes a lot of sense to me. How about some closing statements? So Lou, I'll kind of ask you first before we go to the Q&A. Anything that you want to touch on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's top of mind. It was a very timely study. I think there's some encouraging signs across the board as people start thinking through their strategy to address, lead time, material availability. People have really taken an introspective view of how do they start connecting broader technology platforms from end to end, the whole way from, product development through, their planning and SIOP processes to their big ERP packages to getting machine data on the floor and taking this model-based kind of enterprise approach to data and to systems and helping address some of the underlying process issues is encouraging. So yeah, I mean, there's taking a crisis and being able to maximize it, I think has really energized the OEMs and the manufacturing companies. So that part's exciting. So I'll end on that positive note.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good one. So with that, why don't Richard or Robert, do you want to mention anything before we kind of move to Q&A?
Yeah, the only thing I would just add is, we're a SaaS analytics, software for supply chain, and the good thing is these problems now are becoming clear, and the issue to solve them is clear. So now this journey begins, just like when you talk about Kaizen and continuous improvement, it's a journey. So if we can just keep making improvements every day, every week, that's how we're going to start to solve some of these critical issues today.
Mm-hmm.
And just last thoughts, I've got 100 things I hope organizations do in the future, but I've got one thing I hope really don't do, and that is build warehouses and think that you can finish good inventory yourself through the next round. Like, that's just not going to work. And anybody that thinks that you can use inventory buffers to create flexibility, it's not true. It's incorrect. And I really hope that people aren't driven in that direction.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really the difference between kind of those, short-term containment strategies and the real way to thrive and be resilient in the future. I think that's the really good point as well. So with that, let's move to the Q&A portion. So I'll probably start with a question for you, Richard. So dynamic, and these are questions that were posed by the audience that we have today. So dynamic analytics and predictive intelligence are considered to be most representative of digital transformation. What is the role of new technologies such as AI in predictive analytics?
Well, I think the great thing about AI is that it needs to complement some of your day-to-day workflow. And the way we are leveraging is more around building out, confidence in actions and recommendations. and then creating some explainability so people understand why things are happening, and then automating the workflow to confidently take those actions. So for me, it's about, when we talk about making work easier for people, it's like, what are the 70 or 80% that we can automate, and let's automate that through the use of AI and advanced technologies, and then let people be freed up to work on that 20 or 30% that they really need to focus on. So I think it's, to make it effective, requires that balance, and I think that's the way we kind of approach the use of those types of technologies.
And our next question is actually going to be for Lou. So there seems to be a focus by some manufacturers on solving for logistics delays in an attempt to address current shortages, current shortage economic challenges. And is this a long-term solution?
I think lead time and span contraction should always be part of your strategy. Again, being able to drive that velocity and is very important. And I think it's been hidden, right? I think people lose track of true lead time, and it's impacting, and it's such a huge indicator of how you need to think through your overall material strategy and replenishment strategy. So I think it should always be top of mind. So yeah, I mean, I think through, whether that is thinking that, whether you go more vertical, where the composition of your supply base, getting better visibility into your suppliers' lead times, understanding, so you can do this risk adjusted lead time. So again, not broad strokes of like, hey, I'm just going to open up parameters, which then drives additional inventory. And it gets back to the, I may have, $1,000 assembly that I cannot ship because I'm missing the dollar part. So really understanding, price aside, managing what that risk adjusted lead time is absolutely a critical capability.
Okay, so one question for Robert this time. So we mentioned siloed work hindering execution. What do you think are the most impactful silos in material procurement?
Well, the most impactful silos at a company level are the 4 core processes: strategy, product development, sales and marketing, and order fulfillment or supply chain operations. And these are the 4 core processes that we have to connect first. But if we go down into procurement, I think that, really, this is really Richard's expertise area, in that we reckon, depending on the organization, a buyer and a material planner could be 2 completely different people in 2 completely different buildings. And then, but smaller organization, it might be the same person. But so we've got this, the silo is, you've got one silo who are selecting suppliers, negotiating pricing, negotiating minimum order quantities, negotiating packaging. And then you have another whole area that are actually deciding on a day-to-day what to purchase. And then they find out the minimum order quantities have no connection to usage in the factory. The packaging has no relationship to transportation requirements. And the lead times for the poor planner who had no input into these things aren't allowing the planner to do their job properly. So to me, the silos with respect to materials and procurement would be transportation, packaging, order quantities, and lead times.
Okay. And Richard, given that Robert called you out on this one, is there anything that you want to add in terms of kind of the most impactful silos in material procurement?
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting, I was just going to add, it kind of ties in what Lou and Robert both said, but there's real scenarios where we're helping with shortage management, some of the analytics around shortage management in a factory. And we know that for this factory, this is a priority 1 shortage that's going to stop the line tomorrow. And then when we go to the supplier and we look at, well, what do they see? They see some prioritization of some part that's due 3 or 4 weeks from now. And that one part that's going to stop the line, they didn't even know about it. So when you think about those areas, that's where creating this simple alignment where, our end goal is to make products on time for our customers as efficiently as possible. But when you go down to your supplier and they don't know that, now you've got these problems where they're delivering way too much of what we don't need and not enough of what's needed. And it has to do with that prioritization and collaboration, but around the right information and accurate information. And we've seen, and I would encourage everybody on the call, really look at that, because I think it's a big opportunity right now about creating that clarity of information so your suppliers are working on the right stuff at the right time, getting it to the right place.
Mm-hmm. I have another question that could be for any of you. So let's see who wants to take this one. So the question came from the audience. I certainly see demand changes as business risk and uncertainty, but do we gain anything by calling it supply chain risk? I might ask this one to Robert as well.
Yeah, there's no question that it's risk because, and this is where, you know, and we're going to need a few hours here, I'm sure, on this one. But I struggle with anybody that wants to complain or think that somehow our supply chains failed us during COVID. We are for-profit organizations for the most part, our capitalist system, and that means that efficiency and effectiveness drive our decision making. Because if we don't create profit, then we can't reinvest, we can't treat people well, we can't build cultures and so forth. So the idea that we could just all of a sudden be ready either with inventory or capacity to react to demand going up 10 times, it's just not reasonable, and nor should it be expected. So when we decide how many factories to build, how much capacity to have, what machines to use, how many square feet of warehousing, and how many days of finished goods, those are decisions that are based on some idea of what we think demand is going to be. And then we make a decision, and it's a risk-based decision. We say, do we want to meet that probable demand 100% of the time, 98% of the time, 90% of the time, and then we do some math. So there's no question that the new world of trying to understand demand fluctuations is about supply chain risk decision making.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Robert. Does anyone else want to add to that one? Otherwise, we probably have time for one more question, and then we'll kind of go ahead and wrap this up quickly. So it was mentioned that warehouse buffers are a flawed strategy. Are you hearing any other strategies that you believe are not really optimal in addressing the current issues? Any volunteers on this one?
Well, the one thing I would add, just tying into kind of what Robert said around demand planning, but even it's, you know, just again, having been in this area for years, sometimes you hear we need to plan better, we need to forecast better. And I think that's always true. And it's been true for 25, 30 years, we need to plan better. But the real opportunity is less on that, in my opinion, but more on how do we execute better day to day? How do we create the simple workflows and collaboration? So when I look at that as a strategy, it's always better to have a better plan, but the reality is we know it's going to be wrong. So we got to build out the capabilities to execute better. And that's where I think there's a big opportunity that, you know, that's being surfaced through all the challenges we see today.
So we'll do one quick other question. So what is the best way to fill the gap to get a recovery forecast for production?
Camille, I didn't quite understand the question, sorry.
Okay, let me just take a look at that one again. Or you know what, we have a few that have come in here. Let me ask another one. Do you think the incoming bullwhip effect might impact or slow down economic recovery?
I really, really wish I knew that one, and I'm having a lot of conversations with people about this. It sure feels like we should have a classic bullwhip effect, because we know that we've had what humans do is if you want something and it's not coming, then you order it again. And we've got a lot of that going on, and there's thousands of containers on the ocean. So the question, I think the answer is yes, it's going to create a problem in the economy if we haven't met the pent-up demand yet. And I don't think we know the answer to that. If we haven't met up the pent-up demand, the post-COVID demand, then there's a chance we might be able to absorb the excess inventory. So if the question, in my opinion, if the question is there inventory in the system right now that really isn't attached to true demand? I think the answer is yes. The question is it going to be to such a level that it actually creates economic issues when that inventory isn't required and then starts to get discounted and so forth? And I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, I don't think it's going to in the short term, you know, the next 6 to 9 months. It does have the possibility, right? But there's still, back to macroeconomic policy, there's still a lot of cash swirling around in the system. So, and money is cheap right now. So yeah, until some of those other things and inflation gets in check, I think that's probably more the thing that's going to the inventory freeing up, the inflation that's hitting us has that medium term risk that I would be worried about.
Yeah, and Lou's bang on, and so to build on what Lou just said, so the question will be, so let's assume that we'll sell everything that's headed our way now, but will we keep ordering more thinking it's going to stay that way? And that's going to be, that will make, so maybe the bullwhip effect isn't in the next 12 months, but rather in 24 months if we don't start to pull back a little bit on the reorder points.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. We are out of time. We have gotten a lot of great questions from the audience. We didn't get a chance to address all of them, but we'll find a way to follow up personally on many of those, and potentially have future discussions as well. So with that, I want to make a quick plug for the report again, just so that everyone can, if you haven't read it yet, or if you haven't got a chance to take a look at it, please do download it. We will follow up and send it as well. And we want to thank everyone for having really attended the event that we have today as well. Thank you again to all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Great job,
Take care.
Thank you,
Camelina.
Camelina.